Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Mike Eisenstadt, Senior Fellow and Director of the Military and Security Studies Program at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And welcome to today's event, In the Warlords' Shadow, Embracing New Strategies to Fight the War on Terror. Today's event comes on the occasion of the publication of a new book by Washington Institute Defense Fellow Dan Green, titled In the Warlords' Shadow, Special Operations Forces, the Afghans in their fight against the Taliban. And we're particularly fortunate to have here today the author and General John Allen, who will be providing insights regarding the Village Stability Operations Program, Afghan Local Police Program, that is the centerpiece of Dan's book. So General Allen was most recently the special envoy, or the presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. He had his distinguished career in the U.S. Marine Corps, born at Fort Belvoir, if I'm correct.
That's right.
Graduate from the U.S. Naval Academy, class of 76. He served as a Marine rifleman for most of his career, rising to, most notably for many people who served in Iraq, for his role during the Sahwa, the awakening in Anbar province in 2006 and 2007, where he was Deputy Commander of Multinational Force West, as well as the Deputy Commander of the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force at that time. He was deeply involved in tribal engagement efforts, which were critical to turning things around there. He subsequently served as Deputy Commander and, for a period, Acting Commander of the United States Central Command. He then served as Commander of the International Security and Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan between 2011 and 2013, which covers the period that Dan was in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Commander and Dr. Dan Green, which is the period covered in his book. And as I mentioned before, most recently served as the presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to counter the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. We're delighted to have him here. He's an old friend of the Institute with a tremendous store of life experience and insight. We also, as I mentioned before, the occasion of this event is the publication of Dan's new book. And I should mention that Kramer Books is here and is selling copies of the book. So after the event, please do buy a book, and Dan will be glad to sign a copy for you. Dan is a defense fellow at the Institute. He focuses on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and stability operations in the Middle East and Central Asia. I also mentioned he is a reserve officer in the U.S. Navy, who most recently served in Iraq in 2015 and 2016 as a tribal and political engagement officer in Baghdad. His prior deployments, and he has had, I think, 5 deployments so far, 3 in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, include service in Afghanistan as a tribal and political engagement officer in Uruzgan province. And again, those experiences during that period are covered in his book. As the International Security Assistance Force Joint Command Liaison Officer at the U.S. Embassy in 2009 and 2010, and as a tribal and political engagement officer in Fallujah, Iraq in 2007, where again, I think your paths crossed previously. And then he served as a civilian with the Department of State as a political advisor to the Tarankout Provincial Reconstruction Team, or PRT, in Uruzgan. And Dan is one of the few people who served in the same province in Afghanistan twice at 2 different times, and that informs his approach and enables him to, provided him with unique insights as a result of this experience. Prior to that, he served in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Pentagon and during the State Department during the Bush administration. He's published 3 books, including The Valley's Edge, A Year with the Pashtuns in the Heartland of the Taliban in 2011. The second, which was co-authored with Brigadier General William Mullen, Fallujah Redux, The Anbar Awakening and the Struggle with Al-Qaeda, which was published in 2014, and we had an event for that with General Mullen, and the most recent book, which is the topic of today's event. So 3 books, 5 tours. I'm expecting 2 more books, but I know he has actually a couple more in the works now, and we'll be looking forward to seeing those. He has a PhD from George Washington University and a BA in political science from American University. So I'd like to start off by asking Dan to kind of summarize his book and explain The background to the Village Stability Operations Afghan Local Police / Afghan Local Police program, its kind of genealogy, its roots in the Marines' combined action platoons in Vietnam, how it came to be that he supported the SEALs unit in Afghanistan, how it came to be that the SEALs, who started off mainly, at least in Afghanistan, as a direct action kind of force, evolved to kind of this more nuanced, holistic approach to counterinsurgency, and what it consisted of. And I will then ask also General Allen. Dan will talk about this from the tactical level. I'll ask General Allen, though, to start off with some comments about the VSO ALP program and its role in the campaign at the time that he was there. So why don't we start off, and I'll ask everybody, please turn off your phones at this time if you haven't done so already. And with no further ado, I'll ask Dan to start off, and we look forward to your comments and hearing from both of you on this topic.
Great.
So thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. The Village Stability Operations Program was started in 2010 in Afghanistan, and it was sort of the culmination of a process of learning that took place within the broader U.S. military over the course of the war, but specifically within Special Operations Forces. This includes not just SEALs, but also Green Berets specifically. And what it sort of represented was an accumulation of sort of wisdom about how we could fight this war in a better way. It was an outgrowth not just of our experiences in Afghanistan, but was also informed by our experiences in Iraq. When we first started our experience as a country in Afghanistan after 9/11, we had the greatest will to prevail in Afghanistan, but we actually had the least wisdom about the people of Afghanistan, the culture, and to be frank, the nature of insurgency and how to confront it. And over the course of the conflict, we embraced a counterterrorism approach and also embraced a warlord strategy. So we often would partner with certain warlords in local areas. In this book, the warlord is John Muhammad Khan. And these sort of were answers to our short-term goals. They provided fighters for us, intelligence, some logistical support, and they were very willing to go after the Taliban and Al-Qaeda with varying degrees of strength, but go after them in a sort of serious way. By 2006, the Afghan war, the Taliban returned with a size and lethality that we really hadn't seen since the beginning of the conflict. It had a lot to do not just with the shortcomings of the warlord strategy and that it often alienated people, but also had to do with how the Taliban had also gone through a process of learning lessons. They had adjusted their approach as well. So they tailored their strategy to include not just a political strategy, but also a tribal strategy, reaching out to groups that had been abused by the Afghan government, overrunning areas, acting more like a conventional force than just an insurgency. But around the same time, we had the Anbar Awakening start to take place, beginning in 2005, really culminating in 2006 and 2007. And that experience, for most of you know, of course, is when the Anbari tribes rose up against Al-Qaeda and sought a partnership with our forces to turn against Al-Qaeda. And I think what that was an indigenous effort that eventually had strategic consequences. And it really, I think, across the U.S. military, sensitized it to the necessity of understanding not just local culture, but the influence of tribes and these kinds of organizations. And so as we turned our attention back to Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, there was kind of a new awareness of the importance of tribes, or at least local stability efforts. There was awareness that sometimes insurgent groups have political strategies at the local level as much as they have military strategies, and that we needed to have a bottom-up approach to complement our usual top-down approach. And so the Village Stability Operation Program was this attempt to sort of essentially use the enemy's strategy and structure against him. So instead of a top-down approach, it was grassroots. Instead of a sort of more kinetic top-down approach, this was a bottom-up approach in partnership with locals. So security was something done with them, not to them. It was also an attempt to do development and empower local village elders. So you address the political strategy of the Taliban. And so instead of having SEAL teams, as we famously know, helicopter in, clear a village, clear a valley, they would now live in a village or valley for the course of their tour, persistent presence. Instead of security seeing something we do to locals, it was in partnership with them. And so this approach started in 2010, and it grew over the course of the following years, and encompassed, depending on the final numbers, 120 or so sites across the country. It recruited Afghan local police, which were part-time police vetted by our forces, vetted by the Afghans, who would then get a partial salary and then protect their own villages. And then this effort was nested within the Afghan state, so the Afghans controlled it. It wasn't just creating, militias. And what this did is it really confronted the Taliban strategy holistically and was very effective where it was implemented successfully. And so there are a lot of concepts that underlie this approach that are not just unique to Afghanistan. There are aspects of it that resonate in Iraq and in Syria, as well as in Yemen and other countries.
General Allen, if you could provide a perspective from the headquarters and as commander.
Sure. Much of what we tried to accomplish with respect to the village stability operations, ultimately ALP, we had learned literally on the ground in Iraq in many respects. And I don't think many people know the story that Dave Petraeus was selected by the president to take command in Afghanistan in 2010, and was literally driving to his testimony, his hearing, and he had called Hamid Karzai beforehand and said, "We've got to get this program going." What I need to do is be able to say at testimony that you're in support of it. So he was on the phone actually talking to the palace as he's headed to testify to be the new commander of the International Security Assistance Force. This was a really important program in many respects for me. And I looked at it in several different ways. The first is I had three major special operations components in Afghanistan, and I tried to create a synergy and an equilibrium between the three. At the top end, I had a large contingent of Tier 1 American special operators, JSOC forces, some people call it Black SOF, or national level SOF, whichever term you want to use. I had a large component of those, and those were my strike forces, and I used those on a regular basis, certainly every night across Afghanistan, prosecuting high-value targets in an attempt to take apart their nervous system, if you will, their command and control structure. Then I had what was known as NATO SOF, which was the SOF elements that came from our NATO partners, brave young troops from all across our NATO membership. And we use those primarily at the district level to help the districts develop, in essence, a special weapons and tactics capability so that they could support, district, I meant provincial level, to help the province governors have a special weapons and tactics capability to quickly come to the rescue of the Afghan National Police, if necessary, with special capabilities. And you'd find Albanians in one place and Czechs in another place, and they all were very good at training these forces, and they put their lives on the line quite a bit. And I was very, very pleased with my NATO forces with regard to special operators. And then with the third element was the element that Dan talked about, and Dan has written so well about, and those were primarily American Green Berets. In Afghanistan, it was American Green Berets, who were distributed across the landscape in Afghanistan in a prioritized manner in my headquarters, in a prioritized manner in conjunction with several things. It was in conjunction with our NATO counterinsurgency operations that were underway at any given moment, synchronized with our movement of Afghan national security forces into the lead for operations. One of my principal mandates when I took command was to get the Afghans into the lead, get them into the fight, have them take over the operations. And so we were still fighting, but at the same time we were seeking to move the Afghan conventional forces into the lead, but we also had a very significant Afghan special operations capabilities, commando battalions, and 72 special forces A-teams that we were training, ultimately to augment the American special forces elements at the third level, which was at the grassroots level. And our Green Berets were at the local level, recruiting, training, and helping to deploy and employ the Afghan Local Police, or what we called the Village Stability Program. And the way I looked at this, if you had gone into my office or my operations center, you'd have seen a map, which on that map showed various layers. You would have seen the NATO layer of our conventional forces that were out at any given time doing counterinsurgency operations. You would then have seen a layer of Afghan conventional elements that were considered to be operational, and they were operating in conjunction with our forces. And sometimes, as they moved into the lead, I was beginning to phase my forces out as a main force unit and into an advisory unit. And then you'd see areas where the Afghan local police were deployed. And we synchronized the deployment and the capabilities of the Afghan local police where we'd had success on the ground. And frequently, before we were going to conduct a major operation, we would lead with our special operators to create Afghan local police on the ground to stabilize the environment for us to conduct operations in conjunction with this to achieve a permanent effect. And what this really ultimately did for us, was it created a layered effect. And when the Taliban were pushed out of a population, and we were able to get an Afghan local police unit stood up and trained and advised properly by initially American Green Berets and then ultimately Afghan Green Berets for all intents and purposes, what we found in the terms that I use is we denied that element of the population thereafter to the Taliban. Because theoretically, the ALP unit came from the population, came from the village. They knew the village, they knew who was there, who shouldn't be there, who was passing through. They could recognize an accent from the north as opposed to the indigenous accent in the south. They got all that, they knew all of that, and when they were well-trained and well-advised, we were able to deny large segments of the Afghan population. The ground was irrelevant to me. It was the Afghan population that was decisive both for our success but the Taliban success. And in the intercepts that we frequently were able to pick up of Taliban chatter, they typically said to us, the single factor in the battle space which may be decisive in making their lives miserable or defeating them was the presence of the Afghan local police. It's not to say we didn't have challenges with it. In fact, some of the challenges were quite spectacular, the problems that we had. But on the whole, when I sought to deny a piece of ground to the Afghan Taliban over a long period of time, I could not do that with a high level of confidence unless I had been able to get ALP units stood up and well advised, and then we would fall in on top of them with NATO forces, Afghan forces following right behind that, and that's when we would gain momentum in taking the population centers and the population areas, particularly in the rural areas, away from the Taliban. It gave us if you will, the permanent presence, as Dan said. It gave us a permanent presence inside that population. Later, as we were looking to withdraw from, redeploy out of Afghanistan, and in my conversations with our national leadership back here and our national, or the NATO leadership in Brussels, the question became, given that 80% of the violence in Afghanistan at the time I was departing, which was early 13, occurred in really just 10 districts in the southwest. Much of the rest of the country was relatively secure, but much of the east was vulnerable to the safe havens in Pakistan, in the federally administered tribal areas. The question I would get is, what are you going to do after we pull out the preponderance of our forces, ultimately to preserve the general stability, which we all believed was frankly quite tentative, quite fragile? What are you going to do to preserve that? And we talked about the defense in depth. The ALP was critical to that. The VSO program was critical to that, where with other U.S. agencies having perfected capabilities along the border to pick up the Taliban as they came across the Durand line, so to speak. And as they would try to move, usually Haqqani, move towards Kabul, we would then thicken and deepen the defense along the key avenues of approach and key population centers by both garrisoning conventional Afghan forces, ensuring that police forces were up to full strength, and then in those really critical areas, I ensured, as we prioritized the deployment of ALP, that we got ALP on those key lines of communication from the border with Pakistan to Kabul to create as much friction and resistance as we possibly could in this defense in depth, ultimately to defend Kabul from the persistent attack of the Haqqanis, which, as you may remember, is Mullah Muhammad Omar had promised the Haqqanis the eastern 5 provinces. And as I used to tell our national leadership back here, there is no city on the planet under more constant attack than Kabul. Every single night there were multiple attacks, but the special operators in conjunction with the Afghans and lots of other special elements that we had, were in toe-to-toe combat every single night with these folks. And if we didn't control the population, it would have been a much more difficult suit. We can talk about this idea of indigenous support as we go along. But the ALP VSO program was central to both our stabilizing the population and central to my capacity to convert 150,000 NATO troops into a much smaller advisory force, ultimately to provide direct support to the Afghans to be successful themselves.
Now, let me just ask,
Thanks, Mike.
And this is for both of you. Maybe we'll start with Dan and then General Allen again. We talked about the evolution of this approach as a result of lessons learned process. On the Iraqi side and the Afghan side, was there a ripening of the situation on the ground that, this goes to the debate of, whether pro efforts to create a awakening in Iraq, before 2006 could have worked. But could this have worked earlier on, or did you require, certain objective conditions to exist on the ground that people were kind of so desperate that they kind of, signed on to this? Or could this had we arrived at this earlier, could this have been done earlier in Afghanistan? And could, the Sahwa have happened earlier in Iraq had we arrived at taking a different approach earlier on? Does it need to be a two-side kind of, both sides have to evolve and to a point of convergence, for this to have worked?
I think it would have been very useful to apply this kind of approach at the outset of the conflict, but the challenge with countries like Afghanistan are that we don't have an orientation towards them in our government or in our sort of strategic way of thinking. If you were an Afghan scholar before 9/11, you were kind of considered a bit of an oddity, and this is kind of replicated in a lot of other smaller countries like Somalia, Chad, Yemen even, where there's not a great career incentive to specialize in these countries. And our orientation of our government, not just the military, but State Department, aid, intelligence, is very focused naturally on strategic concerns and broader kind of regional concerns. And so this program was the culmination of experience, and often a lot of mistakes were made along the way. I think it would have worked very well at the outset of the conflict. But again, our understanding of the true drivers of instability, as well as how you build stability in Afghanistan, were very shallow, to say the least. And I think going in, we often had a misconception of what the Afghans genuinely wanted. There was a view at the outset of the conflict that, well, the Afghans like warlord governance. This is how they are, right? It's almost similar to in Iraq. There was sort of an anti-tribal orientation for a long time, seeing it as anti-modern. And so it takes a while to finally go through a lot of these other approaches when you're on your fourth or fifth or sixth rotation, clearing yet the same valley, clearing the same village. You start to ask yourself, maybe there's a different way of doing this, there's a better way perhaps. And I think that, as much as we do lessons learned, the constant rotation of forces is okay if you're an auto mechanic, but it's the other thing if you're working with local communities. And it's that kind of long-term perspective, because again, I think of it as, what is the enemy's strategy, and use that strategy against him versus relentlessly just fight his military forces. You have to fight for sure, but what is his comprehensive approach? And that's the way I think it's a better or surer way of kind of engaging these kind of conflicts.
Yeah, I'm not even sure where to begin to answer this question. One thing I think I can say with great certainty is that the level of ignorance by Americans of indigenous cultures was really breathtaking at the beginning of this. We're to be excused in some respects because we had been organized primarily for wars of maneuver and violence and enormous firepower. So we had been developed for many, many years for the great conflagration which would occur in the U.S., NATO, Soviet model of war. What was very clear, very early, was that without a profound, fundamental understanding of the social dynamics on the ground, you really can't hope to be successful, either in your conventional operations, frankly, or if you do it correctly, in my mind, which is to provide support to indigenous populations ultimately so that they're the solution. It's much, much harder. So you made the comment or asked the question, could we have done the awakening early in Afghanistan or in Iraq? And the answer is I don't know. What I used to say is that the awakening wasn't just about the Sahwa. For me, the awakening was our awakening. I mean, we truly learned to be able to see the Iraqi people in their tribal suits, so to speak, where before organizations would come in and all Iraqis were the enemy, or you go to a particular spot and every one of that particular element of the population was the enemy. As we got better at this, and this is where I would propose it's absolutely essential that Dan's book, the things that Dan has written, have got to be embedded in the culture of education within the U.S. Armed Forces. As we learned that there are centers of influence and control within the societies of these indigenous populations that you must understand in order ultimately to achieve the effect that you want. As we began to learn that, then we had our own awakening. Then we recognized that the tribes, which prior to 2006, the sheikhs and the tribes had largely been lining up with al-Qaeda because the U.S. had, for all intents and purposes, created the perfect storm in Iraq. After the decisive defeat of Saddam's conventional forces, we eliminated the army, we eliminated the police, we de-Baathified the government, and basically threw everyone out of office, and they had very few options except for al-Qaeda in many respects. So as we ultimately realized, and probably a year too late, that al-Qaeda was at war not just with us, but al-Qaeda was at war with the tribal structures as well, because organizations like Daesh, the Islamic State, al-Qaeda, the Abu Sayyaf, Jemaah Islamiyah, whatever they might be, these jihadi Salafist entities cannot tolerate an alternative influence in their midst. And they were wiping out the tribal leadership in Al-Anbar, and the sheikhs and the tribes were confronted with a wicked decision, which was, could they lift up off the fight against the Americans and concentrate only on al-Qaeda and perhaps even make the strategic decision to pair with us? And they did. The fact that we could now see the tribes for what they are and ultimately offer to the tribes something that was meaningful to them because we had studied them, because we understood their value system, because we spent time trying to understand Islam, all of those essential elements of what made an Iraqi along the Euphrates River an Iraqi. Because we then understood that, we had opportunities that we could not have imagined otherwise. And so, to Dan's point, Afghanistan was in many respects the same, but in many respects different. And I learned about my second day in Afghanistan, never say to anyone in Afghanistan, this is what I did in Iraq, because they couldn't be more different. But the immutable principle of having to understand the cultural nuances and the immutable requirement of you to understand the faith or the absence of faith or the nuance in faith, the requirement ultimately for units to come in that really understood the ground is important. And we didn't get this right the whole time we were in Iraq or Afghanistan, because we were rotating forces in, and a force would come into a unit in an area where it had rotated out of Iraq a year before and was coming back the year after, but it would go to a completely different place. Except, frankly, and I'm a joint officer as well as a Marine, Marines got it right in Iraq, because we always rotated back to the same place, the Al-Anbar province. My G2 in Al-Anbar had been there in 03, 04, 05, 06, and 07. My interpreter, a young Marine captain who was an Egyptian, when first time we went to see the sheikhs, I'm just young brigadier, I don't know anything. And I walk in with him to see the sheikhs practically trampled me to go welcome back their brother. So we got that right. We had a societal identification with them that gave us the capacity to have effect at an indigenous level. We transferred that wisdom to Afghanistan in a much more complex social environment, the four corners aspect of it, the northern ethnicities, the western Persian influence in Herat, the traditional Pashtun influence in Kandahar, and the influences in Jalalabad, just west of the Khyber Pass. Each one of those was unique. But if you understood that and then bored down into it, and we rotated the same units back in, you had some prayer of continuity. But without that continuity, what you would often have is units that didn't know the ground, they didn't know the tribes, and they didn't know the operational environment. I'll make one final comment here on this. I speak periodically to military schools, and I made this comment out in the hall a moment ago. 3 years ago, I spoke to a course of young captains. That year, the combat experience amongst that class of American officers in that class was slightly less than 90% 3 years ago. Last year, it was about 70% or so. I'm going to speak to a class here in a couple weeks. They're under 50%. Now, when you think about who is in contact with the people and the sheikhs and the tribes and the enemy, it's typically captains and below who are leading troop formations. So much of this experience that Dan captures so marvelously in this book, much of this that we learned the hard way over 14 years of war is beginning to gravitate up out of the ranks of those who are most in need of this experience when the time comes. We have got to take books like this and get it into our school curricula. We've got to continue to teach the wisdom of a VSO program, and very importantly, to teach about the necessity to understand native cultures, languages, faiths, ethnicities, and so on, because if we drop off of that, it's going to be discovery learning again. We're going to pay for that in blood.
Let me just ask, because you raised the question, or this begs the question of the institutionalization of this knowledge. And I want to ask this, how this is happening or not happening on both sides. So you've got the kind of body of personal experiences embodied in your officer corps and the NCO corps, but you also have doctrine. So how well are we institutionalizing the lessons? In addition, to reading books, do the field manuals reflect these experiences? And are we updating the field manuals to incorporate this? And on the Afghan side, to what degree are they continuing with this approach? I know in Iraq we had a problem in that in some ways the achievements of the Sahwa and then the Sons of Iraq were somewhat mitigated or as a result of the politics pursued by the Maliki government after the U.S. withdrawal.
That's right.
So this goes to the question of the sustainability of the achievements through the process of indigenization. And are we trying to cultivate an approach to governance and politics which is a hard sell in some of these societies when you have a zero-sum kind of winner-takes-all approach to politics, whereas we're trying to kind of cultivate an approach to governance which is inclusive and involves compromise? So if you don't have that, if you don't change the culture, in addition to creating institutions and processes, as Dan wrote about in his book, if you don't change the political culture, how sustainable are these events, are these accomplishments? So if I could ask you both to speak to this, maybe starting with General Allen and going to Dan, about how are we doing on our side with institutionalizing this?
Sure.
And how are our allies, the Afghans first, and then the other ones, is this a hard sell in parts of the region? And those who have practiced it in the past, have they continued doing it after we left or drew down?
I'll make several comments. I'm not in the doctrine development process right now, but we had some pretty good doctrine for counterinsurgency operations, from which then you could extract measures like the VSO, et cetera. And I think the doctrinal pub on counterinsurgency, which was authored jointly by a fellow by the name of Dave Petraeus and another fellow by the name of Jim Mattis, two pretty key players in this process. That generally is still a sound document. It has to obviously be shaped to the local conditions that you face on the ground in an operational environment. But I don't think we can. We must not abandon in the professional military educational curricula of our schools. We must not abandon at least the necessity to understand the people with whom we will serve, or the cultures within which we will execute operations. We have to make that an imperative from the moment a young officer enters the service, and she or he are going to have long service overseas, potentially in expeditionary operations. We've got to imbue them with a sense of personal commitment to understand those kinds of things, and then reinforce it with the curricula and the reading lists that we have. As I said, where the rubber meets the road, where companies of young troops ultimately will be intermingled with local populations, we're seeing that combat experience gravitate up and away from them. So it really is important for us to continue the process of both training and education for this very difficult aspect of warfare. Counterinsurgency operations is PhD level application. Now, the challenge that we have is as we came out of Afghanistan on 31 December 2014, our services ultimately began to turn their sights back to their traditional missions. So the Marine Corps turned immediately to beginning to re-embrace the concept of Marine Air Ground Task Force operations in an expeditionary environment being inserted by naval platforms. So that's not necessarily consistent with counterinsurgency operations, but we also recognize that we may have a fly-in echelon that doesn't come off a ship. So there is a tension about being ready for the next potential conventional war, and I think that potential continues to grow now more and more by the day, versus the potential that if we don't see a high-end conventional war, we have to be ready intellectually and to some extent materially and through training to be able to play in an expeditionary operation that is more along the lines of empowering indigenous populations. And I will tell you, I was actually quite proud of our military, and you can criticize on the edges moment-to-moment process here, but as we ramped up into the counter-ISIL coalition, one of the big decisions that the president had to make was put large numbers of American conventional forces into Iraq again to fight ISIL, or ultimately empower the Iraqi forces. Now, I could take you very painfully through that process where we discovered half the Iraqi military was unaccounted for at the beginning of our intent to intervene. And it's taken a long time to clear Mosul, and in some respects, it's not very satisfying to folks who would like to put maneuver brigades back in on the ground. But we know a couple things. If we are the solution to the fight, then we are in many ways the problem as we start to pull those forces out, because it typically leaves both antibodies and a vacuum. If it will always take longer if we empower indigenous forces, and the decision to do that may have taken longer, and it may not look the way we would want it to look as the U.S. Army and Marine Corps maneuvers on the ground. But if they are the solution, then there is no big sucking vacuum that occurs as we begin to withdraw our conventional forces. And you've got to find the equilibrium there. And now we've seen much of this ultimately play out in Iraq. We're seeing it play out today. We've cleared about half of Raqqa. We still have about 100 clicks of the Euphrates to clear down to Deir ez-Zor. But it's steady and it's constant, and the outcome is not an American occupationary force that's got to come out. It's an Iraqi force or it's a Syrian force that is in place, and they don't have to be replaced with something else. So, hard lessons. We've got to continue to embed it in our education. The Chief of Staff of the Army today, Mark Milley, a terrific young officer, I can say that about 4 stars these days, was a brigadier when I was in Afghanistan. So even our very senior leaders today are gravitating up and out. We have got to institutionalize this wisdom and this knowledge, or we'll be doomed to discover it again if we're not careful.
Yeah.
Right. A lot of the innovations that came about during Iraq and Afghanistan often took place despite our bureaucracy, not because of it. And it often took place by kind of hybrid individuals like Captain Travis Patriquin, for instance, who were sort of almost kind of bureaucratic outliers within their military or their chosen profession, like State Department officers who've been former military, or USAID advisors who enjoyed embedding with the military. I think there's not much of a constituency within Congress as well as in our bureaucracies for irregular warfare. The Green Berets are the kind of premier force for this, as well as the Marine Corps. But as much as they may get something correct at the tactical and operational level, if the politics in that nation's capital you're operating in aren't calibrated well, those victories will be lost. And so one of the other arguments I make in the book is, as much as we need to be really good at doing foreign internal defense, raising local indigenous forces, we almost have to have a complementary effort, which I kind of call foreign internal governance. It's sort of recognition that certainly the State Department has the lead on politics, but the State Department, much like the military, has certain institutional preferences for how it operates. It's not particularly well designed to operate at the tactical and the operational level. And also, they're also fall prey to the problems we have in the military of constant rotations. Just to look at, for example, some of the memoir titles of the British experience, there was a book called 18 Years in the Khyber Pass by Robert Warburton. Right, and I wonder who his detailer was, right? Right, whereas many of us who've written books about this, we inevitably slip in 1 year. My first book has my 1 year in Heartland of the Taliban. And we suffer from this, and we try to address some of that through the Afghan Hands program. But the challenges the Afghan Hands program tried to address are replicated around the world. Really, there should be, looking at a Yemen Hands program. By the time you get to wisdom, you rotate out, and you really haven't gotten to wisdom within a year. And this the same is true for Iraq, for instance. I just came back from Iraq last year. I did Sunni Arab tribal analysis, the same work I'd done in 2007. And it wasn't that I was the smartest guy there. I was just the only one who remembered anything. And you have to look at people and have to help them rediscover databases that were common knowledge in 2007, but were rare in 2015 and 16.
Right.
And that's the kind of learning curve. So you have to it's hard to institutionalize these things, but you've got to. We're already seeing some of the innovations get defunded and disestablished, the human terrain team system, other things of that nature. And these irregular wars are always challenging because they go against the grain of the bureaucracy. But inevitably, you're going to repeat them. That's why the only benefit of our era of persistent conflict is I think it puts these lessons still in front of us every day. So maybe that will help us institutionalize them.
Let me just add, that's a great point. They not only need to be institutionalized, they need to be sustainable. One of the first meetings that I had in Afghanistan was I told my commanders, no more big ideas, no more big Western ideas. From now on, everything we do will be intended ultimately to be an Afghan outcome that is sustainable over time. And I think in the end, if we go back and we total up the costs to the Afghans of sustainment and maintenance of the infrastructure we built for them, we saddled them with a cost that it will be impossible for them to bear over time. Billions of dollars a year for maintenance and sustainment of the infrastructure. And from my perspective, everything we built for the Afghans ought to be sustainable over the long term and not create the same problem thereafter. It has to be at the heart of our thinking when we go into a country and we build infrastructure for a country, and you won't believe it, we wired it for 110 in many places. I just couldn't believe it when I asked the question, how are we going to power this? And the answer was, none of the Afghan electrical equipment would work in the buildings that we built because we built the wrong kind of power into it. So it has to be ingrained and embedded in the psyche of the officers and the leadership that the outcome has got to be an indigenous outcome, whether it's the appearance of the infrastructure or the kinds of schools that produce Afghan NCOs or pick that country's NCOs. Or at the top end, the kinds of officers who are leading formations that are in touch with Afghan capabilities. It has to be an Afghan outcome. It has to be a Yemeni outcome. It has to be, you pick the country. If we build our own outcome, I think we know that it will not sustain very long after we've departed and we've pulled the underpinnings out. It will collapse. We've seen that over and over again.
Let me just ask, I want to draw Dan out a little bit more about one of the points he brought, that he's brought up in a number of conversations we've had, that by and large, the training of indigenous forces is kind of, in the context of the U.S. military, a marginal mission. It's either reservists who did, the MIT teams, by and large, say, for instance, in Iraq in the last decade, and then, the village stability operations were done by special operations forces, which are kind of, they're key actors, but they're kind of not the main, they're not, within the mainstream. And I get the sense, based on what you've said and my own experiences, that this is still not a mission that big Army has embraced, and maybe not big Navy either. And they're glad to kind of push it off to, either reservist or SOF. So is that still a problem? And is this something that conventional forces can learn to do? Because we've seen, in the last decade and a half, we've seen kind of a conventionalization of our SOF, that they've been more integrated into conventional operations in the way that they weren't prior to 9/11, and that we've seen our conventional forces become more special, that they've used a lot of the TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures developed by special operations forces. So is it possible that this could be shared more broadly? These kind of capabilities can be mastered by conventional forces, or do you need really, in the end, are you going to have to rely on kind of the oddball actors and, kind of soft, that, they tend to be kind of, again, not mainstream people. They tend to be kind of more mavericks within the context of their services.
Right. Right, I think that's right. I think we tend to mirror image a lot when we do these kinds of conflicts. So at the outset in Afghanistan, Special Operations Forces were viewed as a counterterrorism force, and as much as they were training local forces, they were training the indigenous Afghan counterterrorism forces. And the same is sort of true in Iraq as well. We have long had association with the counterterrorism forces in Iraq with SOF. SOF's never really been used to train indigenous conventional forces. And where we have trained indigenous forces is usually reservists, National Guard, contractors, the Air Force, the Navy, all patriotic Americans, who love their country. But the idea is what is the right institution to do that? And the whole reason the Green Berets were sort of brought about was to kind of do this kind of indigenous training. And everyone says, well, aren't enough Green Berets to do it. Sure, but at least they need to be put in charge of it. And I think also the Marine Corps, it has a robust small wars history. They wrote a manual about it, for Pete's sake. And they're not often used to that end as well.
That's right.
And I think that these are just huge blind spots in how we operate. And then along those lines, the constant rotations within the Green Beret community, which is like the premier community for raising these kind of forces, there are career incentives that incentivize certain kinds of behavior that are primarily kinetic. Often we mistake what's easy to measure for what's important to measure. And raising indigenous forces is not going to take place within a 1-year time frame. It's a long-term prospect. But when you have to answer to congressional committees every day, you've got to account for money and dollars. It's hard to kind of convince people this is going to take a little bit longer. So this is just something that we always usually get to a point of wisdom before we withdraw. We're kind of just before we draw. We usually get it right just before we leave. And that's kind of, we're at this weird point where we're kind of leaving, but we're not. People are saying we shouldn't do this again, but no, we actually know what we're doing finally. So we're this weird, odd spot right now in the campaign in Afghanistan. But these are just the ways we do things as a country. We have to overcome ourselves to do what's right, I think.
Let me just say, I'll ask one last, this is the final question I want to put out to you guys before we open up to discussion and Q&A here. Afghanistan, if I'm correct, is about 75% rural, 25% urban in terms of the rural-urban population breakdown. So, a village stability operations kind of approach works there in the context of a mainly rural-based insurgency. Looking throughout the region, elsewhere where this may be applied, you're talking about, elsewhere in the region, much more heavily urbanized societies. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the Army studies, or I think their joint studies on the future operational environment, say one of the main factors that will be shaping conflict and influencing conflict is urbanization. Mm-hmm. So how do you, and inevitably urban operations are much more manpower intensive, and we're in a state right now in the U.S. where we don't want, heavy footprint approaches in the Middle East are not going to be politically sustainable. So is this approach, can this be applied elsewhere in the region, especially if we're talking about, conflicts that are heavily urban or urban based? So, what possibilities are there going forward for applying these lessons? Or is this, kind of, again, wisdom, the time for this has really passed. We've drawn down in Afghanistan. We have a light footprint in Iraq. We're not going to go in heavier anywhere else. So, okay, thank you. So, the final question has to do about sustainability. Again, I just, before we turn it over to the audience, I just would like to ask again, how do you ensure sustainable cultural change? Because to me, I think it's not just a matter of building institutions, but it's also affecting a change in the software and the mindset of our partners, so that there's a different way of politics. Because I think, to a great extent, the reason why the achievements of the Sahwa in Iraq, for instance, and the Sons of Iraq were squandered was because kind of returned to politics as usual, kind of the zero-sum approach, and it kind of simply revived Al-Qaeda in Iraq in the form of ISIS. How can we incorporate a cultural change component into our approach, given that you're talking about, we're undergoing political cultural change in our own country because we have polarization, we have the gold standard institutions, but the political culture prevents those institutions from working properly. I'm talking about Congress in the last few years. So we have a problem here changing our own political culture. So how can we accomplish that abroad? So I know it's a bunch of questions I've put together here, and answer them as you see fit. But I'd like to ask you both just for your responses on these. You want to start, Dan, and then General Adam.
I think if you extend the timeline of people's career paths in a country or a region, it's easier to convince, say, your best friend to change their behavior versus someone you've just met, right? And so if you're there for a long period of time, you create the career incentives, you create maybe even tailored institutions that allow you to have a long-term view, that allows you to not just be a military person, but have diplomatic training, development training, these kind of cross-sectional sort of trainings. I think you can do a lot of these things, but you actually have to kind of create, I think, a tailored approach. The constant need to move up the chain in promotions, the constant need to have a out of region tour so you're not too much of a specialist. These impair our abilities to do this stuff. By the same token, in think tanks like in DC, for instance, it's where are our Chad experts and Somalia experts? Where are these? They're sort of not really in DC that much because there's not a lot of incentive to be in this town. There's no one going to fund a Chad endowed chair at a university, for instance. And so there's this big state strategic bias even in our own think tanks, which reinforces these tendencies. So I think you have to create a tailored approach that says, okay, I think we're at a point of wisdom now. We understand we're going to constantly be ready to fight the big wars and do diplomacy with big nation states, but we need this kind of carve out, this off-ramp almost, that allows people to stay in a region for a long period of time. And I think that's a big part of it, and then the cross-training to make sure they see this problem set holistically. Because I think when you don't have wisdom about an area, you tend to defer to your own bureaucratic lens and career path. You tend to conventionalize the problem set, or you see politics if you're a diplomat. You need to have that integrated approach. Because at the end of the day, what is the enemy's strategy? Al Qaeda is still on their first tour, as are the Taliban. And
they're lifers.
They're lifers, right? They have horrendous detailers. But that's just I say that somewhat glib, but just to make the point. They are constantly learning. So like AQAP in Yemen has really adapted their strategy. They're constantly learning. And our approach is multifaceted, of course, but what is their strategy? It's by, with, and through the population. Local governance, enlisting locals, sounds very similar to VSO. And not to say we need to be directly running VSO in Yemen, but the pieces and parts are there. And maybe others who perform them, but we have to at least address them.
General Allen?
I can't really improve on what Dan said. I think the key from my perspective as a leader who was exposed to the national level at the same time I was leading troops that were operating at the tactical level is when we as a nation decide that we're going to engage in a conflict, then everybody's got to go to war. We can't have DOD fully committed to the process and other departments being assigned into the process against their will or grudgingly, or one of the difficulties that we have, and I think we're going to face in the future, is we saw in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we saw routinely young military officers, young foreign service officers, young intelligence officers in the same MRAP or MATV, under body armor, sweating together, sometimes fighting together, sometimes dying together. And it was a natural act for them to work together in this environment. So to some extent, I am really glad that they were exposed to this wisdom that will probably outlast those of us who can't contribute much because we didn't really learn the lessons. So I am confident that there will be some dimension of that culture as these young foreign service officers continue to grow up in the State Department. These young foreign service, these young intelligence officers continue to grow up in our intelligence agencies. And of course, as I said, we're moving up out of the captain's level, but majors and lieutenant colonels and colonels, they'll remember this inherent requirement to collaborate. The question becomes, as Dan said, at the political level, are we prepared? And this is the problem. We have the capacity to see and to articulate a strategy. Where we fail almost routinely in this country is that we don't have the political wherewithal to implement the strategy in the manner that it should be in terms of resources, et cetera. And that is a big challenge for us. And that, I think, we're going to discover in virtually all the administrations, which puts an unreasonable and an onerous burden on the operating forces and the young Foreign Service officers and the intelligence officers. That was what my most recent experience was with regard to the Islamic State, and I suspect it'll be the same in future.
Yeah, I'll just say that in Dan's book, in the conclusions, one of the things he says is that the attrition of political will is a major challenge that we face, and that very often succeeding in these kinds of conflicts requires a long-term approach, but very often the political will to continue the fight for as long as it takes is often not there because of our political system and the like. And how you fix that, I think that's just a fact of life with regard to democracies. And there's also an asymmetry in will between Americans and people who are fighting on the ground, for their own homes. So how to fix that, I don't have the answer. But Dan's book does a great job at kind of setting up the context for that. So we'll go to Q&A now. We have, I'll take down your names as you put your hands up. So keep your hands up for now. We have Tony first, and then I'll just take down a few of your names here. And okay, we'll get to you in a moment. Thank you. Tony, right over there. Oh, I see. We've got to share the mic.
Yeah. Tony Cordesman, CSS. I wonder if you could comment on the impact of transition. You talked about what we learned while we were there. And in talking about transition, there are 4 things about the civil side I've not heard people address from the military side. One is the massive growth of narcotics as a critical aspect of the Afghan economy, to the point where it's basically the only major export at this point, and the production has nearly doubled since we left. Another is the lack of control of the roads, that you have a very sharp problem with increased security. Looking at some of the World Bank numbers, we also pulled a great deal of military contracting and other expenditure out of all of these areas. And then finally, even before we left, we removed virtually all of the NGO and aid presence that was in areas as we pulled out. They actually left before we did. And all of these factors don't seem to get really much attention in looking at the impact on local forces, and I'd really like to hear with your expertise what you've seen happen.
Well, I think everything you said is correct. Inherently, I would say one of the first problems that I discovered as the commander in Afghanistan was that we had not adequately diagnosed the enemy. For me, the Taliban was never really more than a tactical problem. And I used to describe it, I still describe it, as a triangular relationship between the ideological insurgency, which we'll discover virtually everywhere we go, and ideological insurgency of some kind, the FARC, the Taliban, you pick it. Then you have almost certainly in every one of these locations a criminal network of some form or another, which is a local manifestation of the tribes or a local manifestation of transnational criminality, which is another leg of that triangle. And then the third manifestation of the threat, which I would discover but had very little capacity as the commander to deal with, was your first point, which was the drug enterprise that fueled both of the other 2 legs. We have to give whoever is in charge of these operations, whether it's a civilian or a civil military leadership, we've got to give them the capacity with the right kinds of authorities to deal with the entirety of the threat. I could not engage in counter-narcotics operations unless I could absolutely, with unambiguous intelligence, identify that drug lab supported the Taliban. I did not have the authority to do it, but I didn't have the law enforcement capabilities as part of my organization to deal with this issue. In other words, I had the capability of fighting the insurgency and training, but I didn't have the capacity of dealing with 2 of the 3 legs of the threat, which created, I think, the greatest problem. And when I had the opportunity to outbrief the president when I concluded my tour, I told him that the Taliban were a tactical slant operational, but not more than an operational challenge, which could be handled with the right array of forces. That the safe havens in Pakistan were going to be a persistent problem in the east, which, though, if we are able to layer a defense in depth, we can probably hold that at bay. But my final comment was, I believe that we were never going to be successful in Afghanistan if we didn't deal with the corruption associated with the criminal networks and the drug enterprise. And I believe that's still the case. And if we're going to engage in a long-term presence in a place like Afghanistan or in Colombia or wherever, where we actually did get that largely right, we've got to have the combined civil-military leadership and the forces assigned have the kinds of both authorities and capabilities necessary to deal with all those threats simultaneously. And we didn't. Consequently, when we were dealing in some places, when we dealt the Taliban out of the picture, the fight actually got much worse because we were now fighting the criminal networks who were much more capable than the Taliban, but hadn't been fighting us because the Taliban, with their local muscle, paid off with drug money. So this is, Tony, your point's exactly correct. And then the unsynchronized introduction of capabilities into Afghanistan and the unsynchronized retrograde of those capabilities out of Afghanistan was a problem. This is why when we began the process of putting together the strategy to fight ISIL, one of the principal legs of the strategy was a stabilization strategy that followed immediately behind the removal of Daesh from a population center, which we called stabilization of liberated populations. But you'll recall, your writings on Afghanistan were very helpful to us, and you'll recall that President Karzai constantly chafed at the PRTs and called them parallel systems of government because, in fact, they didn't answer to me. They certainly didn't answer to him. They typically answered to the host nation that inserted it, and often Afghans were far more willing to deal with the PRT than they were willing to deal with the provincial governor. And so we had these dysfunctional relationships, all of it well-meaning, but none of it at the most strategic level properly coordinated, going in, during the long-term aspect of the war, and then coming out. And we can just do much better at that in the future. But your points are, we certainly recognize them. I've certainly recognized them. And if I were ever, and I don't think under this administration I'll be asked, but if I were ever to offer advice to a senior commander going back in again, I would start by saying you've got to have the authorities to deal with the triangular threat, and you've got to have capacity with the State Department to orchestrate the humanitarian and stabilization efforts in conjunction with and synchronized with our counterinsurgency efforts. If they're not, you end up with what we have today.
Yeah. Right in front of Tony, right up there. No, right there.
So thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I think this type of topic certainly deserves a much broader platform, as Dan and Michael know.
Identify yourselves.
Okay, I'm Seth Kaplan from SAIS, Johns Hopkins University. And again, I think this is a great discussion, and it should happen many more times. Very important. My question is, this whole discussion presumes that we have lots of boots on the ground. We have a significant military force in country. If I look at the region, Libya, for example, Yemen, for example, we do not have a local military presence, but the problem you identify is the same problem in a different form. What would be the parallel strategy for the United States in countries in which we did not have a significant military presence?
Sure. I mean, you're absolutely right. We had a direct presence in Iraq and Afghanistan, which enabled us to sort of go through this process and have influence we may not have in other areas that are either denied to us or just for policy reasons we've decided to have a different approach. When it comes to Yemen, for example, when we were doing things there, it was training the indigenous special operations forces. Again, doing the same thing we had done in Iraq and Afghanistan. There had been an attempt to have long-term tours in Yemen, but there was a lot of chafing within the units that were asked to do this, to have this kind of long-term presence. So they reverted back to these kind of rotations again. There was an attempt in Yemen to have a civ-mil kind of link-up where there were civil affairs officers working on behalf of State Department in Yemen, which is a great innovation. They would wear civilian clothes but answer to the State Department. These were all just sort of pinprick adjustments. I think you can do this, but it starts with having deep wisdom about these areas. The only reason people know much about Yemen, unfortunately, in our country is because of the counterterrorism threat. For countries that don't have those threats but still have instability challenges, we don't have much understanding of these places. And so I think it begins sort of at the beginning, begin with a deep understanding of these places. What does stability look like? What does long-term stability look like, not just short-term stability? And then go from there. And then ask yourself, okay, well, we may not have a presence there, but the UAE has a presence in southern Yemen. There are things we can do with the Emiratis, for instance, that are maybe similar to some of the things we're talking about. And I think there are ways of doing it. To me, it's a modular approach that you can change the number, the type, the level of it, and who does it, but the concepts are correct. When Yemen liberated southern Yemen in 2012 and 2013, they had popular committees of tribesmen who partnered with them. Very similar to Anbar Awakening, very similar to VSO ALP, but they weren't sustained financially, and inevitably they go away because they're not nested in with the state. So these things are, it's use the enemy strategy. What is the enemy doing? He's embedding with communities, he's enlisting them. Well, then I think that's your cue, what you need to do. But how you go about it, of course, is always the challenge. And it doesn't have to be an expensive approach. It can be light, lean, and long term, but it's got to be high quality individuals who are sustained for their own careers to do this the right way. I would love to have someone, or a team of people work on Yemen for the next 5 to 10 years. The amount of, it would be so helpful to our efforts there. But that's replicated across the world.
I agree with that.
And I've taken your names down in the order that I've seen them, so I'm working. Yeah, please take the mics. Please ID yourself.
I'm David Wood, recently of the Huffington Post, now an independent journalist. I wanted to ask Dan Green about, you mentioned the drivers of instability.
Right.
In a non-kinetic way, what was being done through the village stability operations? Was it enough, and why did that not take hold?
Right. Well, I worked at a provincial reconstruction team in Aruzgan initially, so I was a State Department advisor there, and I went back to the province 7 years later with the military. And often one of the great things we would do, and I think General Allen did this when he's doing Anbar Awakening, is you were sort of seen as an honest broker. And often aggrieved tribes would approach the PRT to talk to us and share with them their grievances against the governor, who was of a different tribe often. That was very helpful. We often were a quiet presence for coalitions within Afghanistan and Iraq that wanted to build a modern state. They were also working against tribalism, working against other aspects of corruption, things of that nature. They knew they had an ally there to help them in their own internal political fights. And one thing I found as a State Department officer is I could talk to anybody, and through understanding things more holistically, I could better inform our approaches so we weren't causing more problems. I think that was huge. Now the VSO program, what was beneficial about it is that we would also do a human terrain mapping at the local level, understand the friction points, empower the elders, often with our good sort of good attention efforts, and then by empowering them, they would recruit or volunteer their young men for the program, and then we would connect them to the state through the Afghan National Police and through our efforts. See, that's what goes back to this idea of kind of foreign internal governance. There are ways of doing it that aren't costly, that aren't particularly kinetic, that I think can be effective. But it takes unique kind of individuals.
And I'll add to that, one of the challenges that we had in Afghanistan was that we had a relatively coherent approach in dealing with Karzai and the government in Kabul. We had good work being done at the local level by the special forces and our troops in general, along with Afghans. But that middle piece was generally missing. The kind of connection we needed at the provincial level and at the district level often. And that created a gap of connectivity, which gave us the coherence that we needed from the national level. And frequently I was okay if the national level wasn't involved, if I could just get that particular quadrant engaged. And one of the challenges that we learned was we were building ALP from bottom up. We eventually changed that from building from bottom up to building simultaneously from center down and bottom up. Often what would happen is the Green Berets would arrive, there would be the empowerment of a big chunk of the local village. They're wearing a brown uniform, they're being trained, they're on half pay for an Afghan national policeman. There's prestige there, and suddenly the district chief finds himself dealing with these organizations that aren't answering to him. We did that for a long time. We realized that we hadn't really harvested the synergy that came from empowering at the district level at the same time we were empowering from the local level. And when we began to create that connectivity, a really important lesson that we learned ourselves, when we created that connectivity, then we had a much more coherent and more sustainable security presence in that area. And I remember the statistic very well. 80% of the ALP, when attacked by the Taliban, stood their ground. Now, they took heavy casualties sometimes, but they never gave up because to be defeated meant their families would be slaughtered, etc. That was a pretty powerful number, and that number went up when ultimately we were able to tie the district chief of police, the PCOP we called him, ultimately down to the ALP leadership. So we would have our NATO advisor at the PCOP level and our Green Berets at the ALP level, and when we were able to tie together, that created a continuity. We never get Kabul to tie in at that level. It was just too hard, frankly, and I didn't know if I would ever get that done. And then, frankly, I put my efforts at the PCOP level and below. When we got that level of stability, it worked magically, frankly.
Second row with the red tie. We're working our way across.
Dan Pollock with the Zionist Organization of America. I applaud the desire to these lessons that were learned with such high cost in our soldiers' lives that we're trying to remember them. But I want to take a step back as a student of history. The generals who ran the Vietnam War, they were some pretty smart people. And in each of our conflicts, we've had to relearn lessons. And as General Allen said, we hadn't adequately diagnosed the enemy. I think taking a look at each of these conflicts that may have been true at the beginning, our leadership at the general level tends to not do a great job when they first get into a new situation. I actually have more optimism than some of you that we're going to do some counterinsurgency things right if we have to do that in the near future because of your book and the other things. But it doesn't give me a warm fuzzy that people in your position at the beginning of these conflicts, they seem to get it wrong nearly every time. What do we need to do to educate generals and admirals so that they are thinking that flexible way at the beginning of a conflict?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think we have to embed our commitment to that education as well as the education itself. I was the director of an organization called the Infantry Officer Course when Saddam invaded Kuwait. In fact, I took command of that organization the day of the invasion. And we were facing a big war in the desert, if you'll recall. And I remember when Marine Corps showed up in my office very quietly one day and they said, how fast can you go to general wartime mobilization to produce lieutenants? Because we believe that you may lose 3 years of lieutenants in the assault ultimately against Saddam's forces as they dug in. You'll remember the fire pits, and we vastly overestimated his capabilities, but he'd just come off a big war with Iran for many, many years, and we thought this was going to be horrendous. We had no doctrine for fighting in the desert and fighting that kind of a war in the desert. I remember General Gray assembled all of the faculty of the Marine Corps University, and he said he'd give every cent of his savings if he just had 4 more people in the Marine Corps who could speak Arabic, much less understand. And I can tell you, I spent hours and hours and hours in the basement of the library of the Command and Staff College reading the after-action reports of British generals who fought in Iraq in World War I, the Battle of Al-Qut and other places, where they had to live in an environment where they were fighting in 120 degree temperatures. And I read all of the German after-action reports and the British after-action reports of fighting in North Africa. What are the maintenance problems associated that we're going to face with sand in this kind of an environment? It just didn't exist. And so your point's incredibly important, and that is we have to sustain a commitment, a national commitment to these kinds of lessons learned and the inherent education of our officers as they proceed through their ranks to be ready for this, because I think we are going to find ourselves in, if not a big insurgency, small insurgencies, as we try ultimately to create resilience in fragile or failing states as they come under increasing assault by extremist organizations. So, it's good business for those groups, and I think that it makes sense for us that as we prepare ultimately for a near-peer conflict, and we have to do that because that's, in the end, the principal missions of our armed forces, we cannot lose sight of the fact that there are key states in the Middle East right now that we just cannot afford to go over the side. We've had a number that have gone over the side. Yemen is a catastrophe right now in many respects. Iraq, look at the price that's been paid to try to bring Iraq back from the brink. Syria is as bad as it could possibly be, but it could get worse, and there could be states that could be as bad as Syria. The capacity for us in the earliest moments of an intervention to try to create a stable security environment within which then capacity building can occur at a governmental level, and in particular economic capacity level, our capacity to do that will be largely unending. And I think it's important, to your point, that NATO has in fact embraced that as one of its upcoming adaptation requirements in order for it to be relevant in the future, which is to be prepared to move to the south quickly with the kinds of forces necessary, ultimately to stabilize fragile or failing states, to preclude another Syria collapse and the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of migrants that we could see flowing into Europe. So look, you couldn't be more right. We have got to institutionalize. We have got to be true to these lessons learned, and we've got to have that be an essential aspect of the education of our officers and NCOs at every level, to include our generals.
Just to build on that, my dissertation was trying to explain how the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is selected. So I looked at the evolution of the Joint Chiefs as an institution and as a system within a civ-mil system over the course of its development. And you see well-meaning reforms like, of course, the National Security Act 4749. The 1958 Defense Department Reorganization Act is as exciting to talk about, as anything. But what it did is it removed the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the chain of command. And I think that there are many reasons that these regular wars are difficult for us. But I think that's a huge factor that a lot of people don't look at. Because I think at the end of the day, it's how does the Joint Chiefs of Staff develop a war plan to do these things correctly? Right now, it is not directly involved. It can be involved if someone desires it to do so, but it's not in the chain of command anymore. And I think that's a huge contributing factor to why wars are less well conceived, why it takes longer for us to learn, to adjust to them. The feedback and leadership loops that existed in World War II between Marshall and Eisenhower have largely been severed. They're there, but they're not compelled. They don't have to be there. And I also think the benefit of the Joint Chiefs, different services have different doctrines or different personalities. Not all 4 stars are created equal. And, to be frank, some should be 5, but, I think there's benefit from that chewing over war plans that it can really help these kind of irregular wars. And I think that's to me, as a political scientist, I look at it as institutions not operating correctly or operating well.
We have about 14 minutes left, and I'm going to piggyback questions now. So we have 2 over here. So if you could get this gentleman and then the woman to the left. So we're going to ask you to just ask your questions briefly. Right over there, yes. Identify yourselves, and then we have 2 more over here.
Thanks. Aman Azhar from Voice of America. General Allen, could you expand on what experiences has proximity to Pakistan brought to the war experience? And do you see that feeding into the new Afghan policy, which is supposed to be announced anytime now? Thank you.
And yes, the other question.
I'm Elizabeth Dvorak-Little. Thank you very much for the elucidating discussion. I'm a counterinsurgency specialist and served at 29 Palms and Fort Polk as a COIN specialist training senior brigade commanders for Battleness Ready for vis-a-vis Afghanistan. And I spent 7 years in mission. And I've very much echoed what you've shared about some of the shortcomings of why we have not succeeded in Afghanistan, and was wanting to take a look at going forward. I personally think that what you point to is, in terms of lack of political will, also speaks to like an overarching lack of national strategy. We only had the national defense strategy under last year of the Obama administration presented that includes an anti-ISIL strategy. And to my knowledge, that hasn't been updated for this new administration, and we're not operating under a new national defense strategy, which would include prioritizing Afghanistan. And so now we are in this place where this country has devolved precipitously, and ISIL and Taliban are at odds. And you look at the map of the country now, most of it is taken by the anti-government forces. With that in mind, I'm wondering where the question presumes that we would prioritize Afghanistan under a national priority strategy, which we haven't yet. But if we do, what would you see as turning things around? From a standpoint, we continue to look at this sort of binary, more troops, not more troops equation, and to me it goes far beyond that. I believe Afghanistan's in a more dangerous place than it was prior to 9/11 in terms of what's happening right now, and I'm wondering if you share that view and how you would see moving in a positive direction to stabilize the country now if in fact we would deem it a national security priority.
Well, I'd say a couple things, and I'll try to answer both questions in the same response. I don't want to make a fine point on this, but I would challenge the contention that most of Afghanistan is in the hands of anti-government forces. Certainly, we've lost ground there. There's no question, and there are contested areas that we hadn't seen before. So I'll stop on that point. But the departure of ISAF and the resourcing of Operation Resolute Support, which came after it, was massively under-resourced in many respects. In two ways in particular, we had talked about what we called the pervasive touch with respect to the Afghan National Security Forces. In other words, having sufficient surface area of the advisors, trainers, and enablers to be embedded in all of the Afghan corps and to be prepared as necessary to provide advisors to brigade level, ultimately for brigade-type operations. Under the theory that the longer we are engaged with the Afghan National Security Forces in a robust way, the pervasive touch, the more we can up their professional game over time. We thought that would take 20,000 troops. We started with 9,500. And then we started coming down from there on a very precipitous timeline, very unrealistic, which forced the president in the end to have to change his mind a couple of times on both the numbers and the timeline. So we find ourselves in a position today where we want to insert troops back in, and you're correct. The issue of policy, we still don't have a policy. We're looking for it. I think people who know what they're doing have been trying to formulate this policy and get it out. There have been questions about some number between about 3,000 and 5,000 additional American forces going back in and some additional non-U.S. NATO or European or partner forces going in. The point is they're going in not to fight, but to once again attempt to extend the pervasive touch to help Afghans recover ground that has been lost and those who are in place to improve their professional capabilities. So I don't know what the final policy is, and my hope is, and I've been asked by the media and others, is it a good idea to give Jim Mattis the kinds of discretion that permits him to deploy some number under that cap of, say, 5,000, just for argument's sake, at his discretion to do that? I absolutely think that's correct. First of all, the Secretary of Defense should not have to come back constantly to the PC or the NSC in the White House sit room asking for penny packets of troops when, in fact, if the Secretary of Defense is in constant conversation, both the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commander and the theater commander, he doesn't have to do that. He'll know what he needs. We also have in Jim Mattis somebody who actually knows something about warfighting at a very intimate level. So I applaud that decision, and if it's ultimately and finally announced, I think that will give the Secretary of Defense capacity to make a change on the ground in ways in conformance with Mick Nicholson, the commander, that can make a difference. But we're way behind the power curve now. We're way behind the power curve. And you may recall a letter that we authored at Brookings that had all former commanders, all former ambassadors, and all former SRAPs that basically said to the president, please stop making decisions. Let's not mortgage for the next president the outcome by continuing to make decisions right now that would put the next president, next commander-in-chief at a disadvantage. Well, we continued to make decisions, but I think we stopped at a certain point. We also needed really to evaluate Afghanistan not from a security perspective, and this goes to Tony's very important question. As we began to think about what troops needed to go back in, it's not a matter of numbers. It's a matter of capabilities that those numbers represent. But it doesn't make sense for me to analyze what kinds of troop levels are in Afghanistan, apart from the stability of the governance in the country, and what other capabilities in conjunction with military trainers are necessary to help to stabilize the political process. Remember, we're in the first real democratically elected government at the end of this war with Ashraf Ghani, and of course we're in the unity government with Abdullah, so we have that challenge. And then that analysis should not go forward as well without a comprehensive analysis of the economic environment. So the three of those three things should be and should have been analyzed together so that the security platform we seek to create is a security platform that creates an environment for continued progress in governmental development. At the same time, it fosters an environment in the aftermath of a massively distorted economy to start to get on its feet. Those three things are inextricably linked. You can't talk about a long-term strategy for Afghanistan only in security terms. We have to think in those three terms, and I'm not sure that our policy is that comprehensive. But let me, to the question about Pakistan. I think Pakistan continues to hedge its bets with respect to Afghanistan for a whole variety of reasons. I tried to work very closely with General Kayani when he was the chief of the Army staff there. We had the very unfortunate, tragic incident of the American Special Operations Unit that killed 24 Pakistani troops on the border, and Pakistan shut down our ground line of communications out of Karachi for 7 months, looking for the apology but trying to starve out the campaign. And that was not successful, but the problem was, while I still had a large force on the ground, and General Kayani and I had a good relationship, and we had planned extensive operations on both sides of the border for him to move them away from the border on his side or push them across the border into my firepower. We were over the map, working that in great detail alone in his conference room. When I went to bed that night in Islamabad, I woke up the next morning to the killing along the border, and we lost the decisive moment in the war to be able to do that. Now, I do believe that Pakistan will continue to hedge its bets. I don't think that there's a certainty about the outcome in Afghanistan. As much as I would like to say that we're going to be successful there, I don't think I can say with 100% certainty that the outcome there is what we want it to be. I think we'll be successful, but if you're in Islamabad or Rawalpindi, and you're very concerned about an unstable Afghanistan in your strategic rear area, an unstable Afghanistan into which India might ultimately create its own presence to try to, with its own special relationship with Afghanistan, stabilize the situation, I think we're going to find that Pakistan will continue to hedge its bets. But I also would be very quick to say that the United States needs to be very careful about its continuous relationship with Pakistan being dominated by punitive reflex. There's lots of ways that we've had a wonderful relationship with Pakistan in the past. It's troubled now, and it has been for a number of years. We should be looking for ways where we can cooperate. Now, I guess Nawaz Sharif resigned today, so I have no idea where this is going to go. But my view is, as long as Pakistan believes that the outcome in Afghanistan is in doubt, we will see them hedging their bets. We will continue to see the federally administered tribal areas be the safe haven for wintering over the Taliban, which means then we have to think in certain ways to create the defense in depth necessary from the border, ultimately to defend Kabul.
Okay, we have just about 3 minutes. I'm going to ask, we have two last questioners. Very quickly, ask your questions, please, and then we'll ask for a quick response.
Yeah. Mike Kraft, former State Department Counterterrorism Office. A question about lessons unlearned. I understand the British made a big effort before the coalition went to Iraq to study the tribal culture with some help from the Jordanians. Didn't we learn anything from the British? And then on the Afghanistan culture and the issue there, how can we hope to affect the cultural aspects with civil service, civil officers, etc., when the administration proposes to cut AID and State Department budget by 30%?
And in the back there, very quickly, please.
I'm Bill Manchuk, and I'm an independent analyst. And I'd like to see a comment about Abdul Razik, who's a police chief in Kandahar. Seems to be very effective but controversial. Is he the type of leader that the U.S. should try to identify or replicate?
I went to see Karzai a couple of times about removing him. Quite frankly, it's one thing to be effective; it's another thing to be. I won't use the adjectives here, but he was a problem. He was a problem, and I guess if you kill enough people, then you can appear to create stability. But he was a problem. It's one of the reasons I didn't spend a lot of time in Kandahar as a city, because I was not going to empower him by my presence and being personally acquainted or associated with him. I could do a lot of it by distance, and I could do a lot of it by listening closely. Say again quickly your comment again.
Expertise and cultural knowledge and.
Yes. Thank you. That was fundamental to how we operated in Iraq and later in Afghanistan. I read every word ever written that I could get my hands on by Gertrude Bell and Sir John Glubb Pasha.
I'm talking about the President supposedly made an effort.
We never saw any of that. Now, much of what they did, I'm not dismissing it. I never saw it. Much of what they did in the south, associated with Basra and their relationship there. The great studies that we saw with respect to Al-Anbar, which was by and large a closed Sunni society, was the work that had been done, the cultural and anthropological analysis that had been done by Gertrude Bell, which 90 years later was still enormously relevant. I was able to tell sheikhs stories about their grandfathers that Gertrude had written in sort of naughty shorthand that they had never heard themselves, and it gave us enormous capacity to identify with them.
Dan, you get the last word on this.
No, I think the two sort of buckets of knowledge and books I've read the most since 9/11 are books about the U.S. experience in Vietnam and the British experience, not just in Iraq, but also in Pakistan, in Yemen, and Afghanistan. I have a sizable personal library now, these obscure memoirs of these British officers in the frontier doing this work. And I have reprinted the Arab Bulletin, the intelligence reports from World War I. And honestly, we don't replicate these kind of books in our own culture very well. And the publishing industry tends to privilege combat narratives. There are books from these wars. There's one called Carnivore. There's one called The Reaper, Rage Company. They're all wonderful books in their own way, but there's not this deeper sort of cultural understanding. There's just, if it bleeds, it leads, but if it's wise, it doesn't seem to sell. Right. I mean,
it's a disaster, frankly. As Mattis said some time ago when he testified, he said, if you intend to cut the State Department budget, then you got to buy me more ammunition. Let me tell you, one of the reasons the United States is a great nation, apart from the campaign, one of the reasons the United States is a great nation is because of our diplomats and our State Department at the leading edge of American influence. That's why we're a great nation. And when you cut the State Department budget by 30%, and you talk about largely eliminating the independent identity of USAID, it will create requirements and opportunities for Marines and soldiers in places that we're going to end up having to pay with in ways we don't want to.
And I'll just say in closing that we'll continue to do what we can do at the Washington Institute to support our men and women in uniform and in the Foreign Service. And you can, if you are interested in Afghanistan, you can do no better than getting Dan's book, In the Warlords Shadows, which is available now outside. And I hope you will look at it and read it. And I hope Dan will continue with his track record of these excellent books. So
well done,
thank you all, General Allen, Dan Green. Thank you very much, and thank you all for coming here today.
All right.